I kind of hate it when people ask this question, but because Vision Pro feels like such a unique and different product category for Apple to be entering, I feel like we kind of have to speculate on it, but the reason I usually don't like talking about it is because we truly don't know. I can't speak for Steve. There's so many variables at play at some hypothetical scenario. If he was around, would Apple have taken this direction? What would the iPhone be like? What would the Mac be like? The Apple ecosystem could be totally different if he stuck around all these years, so there's no right answer to this. We can really just base our speculation on how Steve behaved in the past, what he prioritized in his product categories, and try to carry the fundamental visions of what Steve liked as to come up with some kind of answer to how he may have felt about new product categories like this one. But I think it's very, very easy for people to just assume, well, the iPhone had a headphone jack when Steve Jobs was around, therefore he would always want the headphone jack there. It's not really the kind of person he was, but with the context of understanding we'll never truly know the answer to this, let's talk about how Steve Jobs would feel about Vision OS. So because it's a very complex product, I don't think there is a one-size answer for any of the questions we may have. A lot of people in the comments on my last Vision Pro video are very insistent that there has to be this one or the other thing. It's either going to replace the smartphone or it is not going to replace the smartphone. Whereas I think the truth is kind of somewhere in the middle. Same thing when the subject comes to Steve Jobs. I think there's aspects of it that he wouldn't like, and there's probably some aspects of it that he would. But because a lot of the Apple fan base seems torn on this product from the get-go, let's explain some of the things that Steve probably wouldn't like. If we go back to the product categories that Steve introduced, whether it be the Mac, the iPhone, the iPod, the iPad, he had a tendency to brag a lot about portability, about how thin and lightweight a design was, and personally, I don't really think he would be that proud of the bulkiness of the headset. It was definitely much thicker and bigger on our faces than a lot of the concept artists were imagining, and the idea that you have to pack around the battery pack and have a wire going to your head, that's something I could absolutely see Steve pushing back on and maybe trying to keep this product behind closed doors and not reveal it to the public until they found a way to miniaturize it and improve the battery life so that you don't need a wire and the product could just be all-in-one. That's something Steve pioneered in the personal computing space. He did not like the idea of a computer being a tower with a monitor and speakers on the side and the keyboard and mouse. No, he wanted all of it to be combined into just one single product that could do everything, that could get more compact, that you could take with you and fold up and put it in a briefcase or fit in your pocket. He loved that simplicity and keeping things small, lightweight, and thin. A lot more so, in my opinion, than you notice in today's phones. You typically don't see Apple brag too much about how thin they got the iPhone anymore, or even the iPad, probably just because they've gotten to a point where everything is so thin and portable that most people don't care, but we still get our, 15-inch MacBook Airs from time to time when they brag about the lightweight thinness of it. But Apple didn't really disclose much about the weight or the official dimensions of the Vision Pro, which is something I think if Steve were around, he maybe would have bragged a lot more about and maybe stressed out the engineering team a lot harder on how to get this thing smaller and more compact and more portable. I tend to think that Steve Jobs, as a visionary, was able to push software and hardware engineers further than they could have gone anywhere else because he was intimidating and because he was pretty aggressive to his employees. So that makes me think that Tim probably doesn't accelerate innovation as quickly as Steve may, but it may result in Apple's own employees not feeling as stressed out and not requiring as much therapy as Apple used to back in the Steve Jobs era. So should technology progress slower for the sake of the employees not feeling as stressed out or disconnected from their families all the time? I guess that's a debate for you guys to have for yourself. There was definitely countless stories of how ruthless and mean Steve Jobs could be in interviews and meetings, and that likely did push people to create products that were better than what any of the competition could come up with. And you don't hear those kinds of stories about Apple's current staff. It's just not going to fly in today's world, and I'm kind of grateful for that. I'm okay with the headset being a little bulky or technology developing a little bit slower if it means everybody can go home happy at the end of the day. Another issue I could see Steve butting heads with a lot of Apple's executives on is the pricing of Vision Pro. $3,500 is steep, and I'm not saying saying Steve would have found a way to release it for, $1,000 or even $2,000, but I do think if he got behind the idea of augmented reality taking over, which there's actually some interviews from when Steve was still around talking about what could have been possible if the invention was out there for some kind of displays that only your eyes could see. He was kind of comparing it to like headphones for your eyes. Like we had the technology when Steve was around to put a little earbud in your ear that can practically sound just as good as being in a live concert, except you're the only one listening. And he said it would be interesting, it would be a different world if we had the technology so that just you could see certain displays that were indiscernible from a typical TV or tablet or laptop. He admits in that same interview, no one's invented that yet. We don't have that technology.
You put a pair of headphones and you get the same experience you get with a great pair of speakers. There's no such thing as headphones for video. There's not something I can carry with me that I can put on and it gives me the same experience I get when I'm watching my, 50-inch plasma display at home. Until somebody invents that, you're going to have these opposing constraints.
So it's really cool to see those interviews resurface now because it showed the idea that even when Steve Jobs was around, which was over 12 years ago now, they were having this discussion about what the future of computing may look like. And I'm sure Tim Cook probably had some discussions with Steve Jobs about this very topic, and that's why it's clearly been in development for many, many years. I don't think this is just a recent thing. We've seen evidence of it within iOS code. There's been rumors of it going around for years, and Tim Cook in interviews from 5-6 years ago made references to how he's very excited for the future of augmented realities. I think there's a decent chance this has been in development for potentially a decade plus, and they're just now feeling like, okay, we think the technology is relatively affordable enough that we can actually start getting an income stream on this. And because Steve, I think, was a bit more aggressive towards trying to get people to adopt things and trying to get people on board, this is the future, get over it, like, don't be obsessed with yesterday's tech. Once there was a newer generation of technology available, Steve Jobs typically put all of his focus towards that. He didn't dwell too much on the past once there was some new tech around. There were these great interviews of him explaining how his work wouldn't be like putting paintings up in a museum where you're going to admire it and look at it for centuries to come. He said in the tech world, computers of that time would be looked at like layers of sediment forming a giant mountain. Like, yes, that layer of sediment helps the mountain get as tall as it does, but you don't look at that sediment. You don't really rip open the mountain all that much. You really only look at the peak and what's on the face of it. So that's why when the iPhone came around, that kind of took the forte of his attention. Same thing with the iPad. And yes, there's still development and work going on towards the Mac, but it wasn't as frontally focused as the iPhone had become for him. So similarly, I think he might have pushed for it to be even more affordable, but I don't think he necessarily would have won that out. There was tons of stories about how Steve wanted to push for margins not to be quite as great for the sake of, but this tech is really cool and we need it to be accessible to the masses. And that's partially why Apple probably was not worth as much when Steve Jobs was in charge, was because he wasn't a master of profit margins. And Apple's board actually voted him out of the company way back in the day because he wasn't running the brand in a way that was leading towards profitability or success. And they didn't like how much he was pushing for, let's just have really cool, really game-changing tech. Apple's board was more focused on, let's see what's profitable, let's see what has good margins. Whereas Tim Cook, I think, as CEO, is going to prioritize that a little bit more because he's the supply chain guy and because he tends to analyze all of the parts and components that go into a product and how to scale that to varying markets. Whereas Steve, I think, was more obsessed with just getting the product right and making it useful and intuitive, and he didn't really care too much about how well it sold. His focus was never on trying to sell the best or having the most market share. He just wanted to have the best version, even if it didn't sell all that great. But all that being said, I do absolutely think there's a ton of things that Steve Jobs would have liked about Apple Vision Pro, and there's evidence within his career that would point to that. Like when the original iPhone debuted, he talked about why we didn't need a stylus on our phone. We could just use our fingers and that was good enough. And I would say that rivals and is very, very similar to Apple's approach with hand tracking and air gestures rather than relying on controllers. Because at the time the iPhone came out, it was actually very, very common for smartphones to come with a stylus, and that's how you interacted with it, because multi-touch displays were not that precise and not that intuitive, and they weren't that accurate. Whereas Steve was all about, no, the product is just on its own, your hands are good enough to control it, and that's how we're going to figure out pinch to zoom, and we're going to twist with multi-touch gestures, and that's going to be the future for personal computing. And it blew people's minds because we had never seen like the simplicity of just scrolling with our fingers fingers and not having to rely on arrow keys or a stylus or so many physical controls. No, you just use your fingers. And that's pretty much Tim Cook's approach with Vision Pro. You don't need a controller, even though that's pretty much what all other VR headsets ship with. And based on most people's impressions of the Vision Pro demo, it seems like the hand tracking is incredibly good, as is the eye tracking with Vision Pro. So the simplicity of the navigation is just you look at what you need to look at and you tap your fingers together when you want to click, or you can hold and drag, or you can use two hands if you want to zoom in on things. And I think there's going to be a lot of potential that comes from just using hand tracking, and Apple's probably going to have the best in the biz out there, which in my opinion is still part of the reason that iPhones are still much more sought out there than Android, simply because they get that multi-touch gestures and operating system fluidity better than anybody. And if you've listened to the most recent episode of the Waveform podcast, they kind of compare the Vision Pro hand tracking to the multi-touch gestures that the original iPhone came out with. And they said it feels very, very similar to that launch. And I think the bigger question that this is all kind of leading towards is, would Steve Jobs be in favor of spatial computing versus the iPhone anyway? Or would Steve be more of a, no, I want a small pocketable phone that I can easily just take out and use and then put it away when I'm done? Or would he come around to the idea of a headset that's capable of showing all of your computing tasks and windows and applications just around you and interacting with it in real time? Of course, we'll never truly know, but based on those interviews in the past, I feel like he was at least thinking about the concept for it. And while I could totally be wrong on this one, I think that the Vision Pro actually perfectly encompasses what Steve Jobs wanted computing to be. He didn't look at the iPhone as an accessory, as a product that you bought and used. His mindset for it was, it's an extension of yourself. And the reason Steve Jobs was so obsessed with smaller tech and thinner tech and getting things really, really portable and easy to take with you is because he was in favor of essentially the hardware disappearing. He didn't want you to think about the fact that you're using a computer. He just wanted it to feel like an extension of yourself. And here Marquez say, after his 30-minute demo with Vision Pro, that the eye tracking of this headset felt downright telepathic, like so precisely accurate with how your eyes were looking around the UI. I feel like Steve Jobs would have appreciated or would be proud to explore this technology further. And that's something that Tim Cook has taken advantage of with the marketing of this device by making its slogan kind of, this is the first Apple product that you look through, not at. It's not necessarily something you hold and stare at like you do an Apple Watch or an iPhone or an iPad. It's not something you set up on a desk like a laptop or a desktop. This is just something you put on and then it blends in to your environment. And yes, the hardware is very early. I know it's quite bulky and expensive, and it's not going to blend in as naturally quite yet. But I think what they've made pretty obvious by the fact that they didn't show a huge gaming emphasis on this, and they always are demoing it in your natural world, not in some hypothetical metaverse, that points to that original Steve Jobs idea of your computing just blending into your surroundings. And I think it's pretty clear that the end goal of Vision OS and the Vision Pro headset is to turn into glasses, is to be something that isn't so bulky and heavy. And that's going to take a long time. It could take several decades before we get the hardware thin enough and efficient enough that you don't need to carry around a big battery bank in your pocket, and you don't need a strap that goes completely around the back of your head, because that gets tiring and that gets old, and it might be hard to just kind of quickly take off because you're going to have this big headset hanging off your neck. But with time, with proper optimization of Apple Silicon and improving display technology, and I think Apple's mindset is, by selling this product now for a high price, we can prove that there's market demand, market interest in it, and we can prove that there's revenue potentially coming from it. And with that revenue, they can use that money to further the development, make it more affordable, make it smaller, and they've established with the first generation what at least the user interface needs to be like, how good the eye tracking needs to be, how good the resolution needs to be, and how good the hand tracking needs to be. And then we can work our way towards all of the limitations like the battery life and like the size and the aesthetics of it, of course, which are not as fashionable as traditional glasses. But as it becomes more slimmer and aesthetically pleasing and more fashionable, I think a lot of what they learn from Vision OS and from these early days will be carried over to those eventual glasses. And that's when our computing and how we use TVs, tablets, and phones may start to fundamentally change, because now you're not bound to, oh, let me get my phone out of my pocket pocket, or, oh, let me tilt my wrist to check the time. Let me get the TV remote to turn on the TV. Now it just kind of plants a giant display wherever you want it to be. You could be on a plane, you could be in a hotel room, you could be in the back of a taxi, you could be out in the wild camping and suddenly decide, yeah, I want to have a big screen TV with me, or yeah, I want to check the weather, check my Twitter, or check my email. Even if you're on the toilet, you're going to have way more options than what you currently have now, which is, I guess, what the future's all about. More ways to compute when going to the bathroom. Wow. But still, the concept of just the hardware itself disappearing, you know, getting rid of bezels, getting rid of these barriers by what displays are capable of doing by fitting in our pockets, how much can we fold them, how big can we make them, and then how portable can we make them. All of that starts to dissolve away, which is something that Steve was likely pointing towards with his desire to make everything thinner and lighter. So, am I wrong? Do you think Steve Jobs would be totally against Vision Pro, or do you think he would be in love with it? Do you think he'd be proud of Tim and what he's done with Apple as it is today? Regardless of what you think, I would just want to remind everybody of something that Steve was very worried about near the end of his life, which is that Apple would try their hardest to do what they think Steve would want it. And he was concerned that if the company was run in a way that was trying to pay homage to Steve, or we need to do what Steve wants, then the company would fail. So the reason he chose Tim Cook was because he said Tim was willing to do things out of the ordinary, and he was willing to admit when he was wrong. And he saw value in that, he saw leadership in that, and he warned Tim, do not do what you think I would want. Do what you think is right for the company. And I personally think in many ways Tim has done absolutely that. I think he's diversified the product lineup a lot more than Steve likely would have. Look at how many Macs there are. I mean, Steve came back to Apple and cleaned up the Mac lineup because he was sick of how many different boxes and trims they had. And he also liked the iPhone being quite small, whereas now the iPhone seems to be getting bigger and bigger each year. But the iPhone's also never been selling better than it is right now. So I think it's okay if Apple chooses to do things that Steve wouldn't have wanted. But regardless, it's fun to speculate on what the original founder of the company would think of a brand new product category that is kind of changing the trajectory of what computing could be. So I'm loving the conversation. I love the comments, both good and bad, that you guys are providing. It's a fun debate, and it's definitely reignited my interest in Apple in the tech community. In my opinion, this is just far more fun and exciting to talk about than, ooh, a MacBook Air that's bigger now. Okay. Cool. So feel free to speculate along with me in a way that is hopefully polite, respectful, and well-researched down in the comments below. And thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. It seriously helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I will see you all in the next one.